Hello, everyone, and welcome to PressThis, the WordPress community podcast on WMR. This is your host, David Vogelpohl. I support the WordPress community through my role at WP Engine, and I love to bring the best of the community to you here every week on PressThis. As a reminder, you can follow me on Twitter at WPDavidV. You can subscribe to PressThis on Red Circle, iTunes, Spotify, or download the latest episodes at WMR.fm. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the backwards compatibility conundrum with WP-CLI. And joining us for this conversation is someone who knows quite a bit about WP-CLI, the lead contributor for WP-CLI of XWP. I'd like to welcome Alain Schlesser. Alain, welcome to PressThis.
Hi, David. Hello, and great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So glad to have you. And this is at least your second time on this show. We've been asking you questions about WP-CLI over the years and really enjoy having you on. For those listening, WP-CLI is a critical part of the WordPress ecosystem, particularly around automation and workflows and other aspects of WordPress builds. And what we're going to be covering today is Alain's thoughts on what has been accomplished with WP-CLI over the last year, what backwards compatibility changes lay ahead. You know, backwards compatibility is a huge part of the benefit of WordPress, but also the challenge of software developers. And of course, how those challenges are being addressed. And Alain's going to share a little bit about ways you can contribute to WP-CLI towards the end. So I'm really looking forward to the interview. So Alain, I'll ask you the same question I ask every guest, and I've asked you this before, but I want you to tell it again if you could. Could you tell me about your WordPress origin story? When was the first time you used WordPress?
Yeah, so my origin story is like most WordPress stories, starts with a smaller detour. I worked as a government agent in Luxembourg. And at one point, I really got fed up with the politics of everything. I wanted to do something else with my life, trying a different career. And I decided to do freelancing development because I had already done development before, but I never did it as a freelancer. And when it was time to actually decide on what to focus on, I just looked at what was out there and what had the biggest market share at the time. That happened to be WordPress, as we all know. And I just started with WordPress development because I thought that it would be the easiest one to get clients as a fresh freelancer who starts from zero.
Oh, you and I chose WordPress as the platform of choice for the same reason. I remember a great debate in my agency between Drupal and WordPress. And I think at the time, Drupal was the correct choice, but it wasn't what people were calling about. So I was like, oh, we'll go with the WordPress one. But this was 2010, you know, right at the cusp of custom post types and meta fields. And I'm just wondering, when you were making this decision, what year roughly was this?
That was 2014, summer of 2014. And I think WordPress was around version 3.2 or something like that, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure, to be honest.
So for you as a freelance developer, the benefit of custom post types had already been released. And so you were kind of walking into this ecosystem and seeing those capabilities. WP-CLI was still another 2 years away, though. So I'm guessing it didn't fully answer everything you needed as a developer, but you know, it's great to see you managing that project now. Now, I understand you do work with XWP, and tell me what XWP does and what you do there.
So XWP is an agency focusing on high performance enterprise-grade WordPress projects. The main focus is on performance, but not only in terms of how fast the site loads, but also how well it meets your business objectives. I'm working with XWP for 2.5 years now, approximately. And during that time, I have been working on the AMP for WordPress plugin and then the page experience for WordPress plugin together with Google.
Those sound like meaty projects. I'm definitely familiar with AMP. I haven't, for WordPress, I haven't played around with page experience yet, but I know, XWP, we've had a few folks from XWP actually on PressThis. They do some really, really cool projects. It sounds like you're getting to work on some of the coolest ones. So that's awesome. Relative to our topic for the show, though, today, WP-CLI, from the high level, I'm assuming there's going to be some listeners that have no idea what WP-CLI is. I was wondering if you could frame it up for folks so they could understand what WP-CLI is.
Yeah, sure. So WordPress has its admin backend where you do all the maintenance of the site, where you make the changes, where you configure the options. And WP-CLI is a different interface to controlling your WordPress site. It is an interface that you can use from the command line. So you type commands in text form to control your site. It allows you to do everything the admin backend does and more. And by using the command line, that happens to be a much more expressive interface than the admin backend, you can solve for a lot of problems that that are very specific to your use cases where there is no pre-made user interface element in the admin backend. You can just mix and match the WP-CLI commands to solve these problems anyway. And then as a step further, anything you can do with WP-CLI, you can also put it into a script and automate it. So you can automate all of your management processes, and you can even execute them remotely. So there's a lot of power by going to a text-based interface, and WP-CLI allows you to do that with WordPress.
Wow, that was really elegant. I think you have another career in marketing along. That was a very nice way of framing up WP-CLI. I don't know if I've ever heard it described that way. That was very good. Okay, so in my view, and I have a little cheat sheet for the timeline of key moments in WordPress history that I use when I hear people's origin stories to like ask them about when they entered and what was going on at the time. And WP-CLI is actually one of the key moments in WordPress history that I call out here. Back in 2016 in the timeline view I maintain it. So I think it's super important. And I know that, there's this push to get more and more features and capabilities released, but I'm just curious, relative, like to say the recent batch of releases, relative to features or refactoring or whatever, what were you most excited about in recent releases?
So one very exciting feature is the addition of a global context switch. We have since the tool was built, there was always discussion about the context in which the tool should execute. If it should execute as a front-end process or an admin process or something in between. And all of the approaches always came with their own set of problems. So there was never really a clean solution. And the way WP-CLI executes by default is this weird mixture that is neither an admin process nor a front-end process for historical reasons. But that means that some processes that check whether the current request is an admin request, for example, they will then automatically fail. This happens most notoriously with premium plugins and themes when you run their updates. So usually you will see that those updates, they work in the admin backend, but with WP-CLI, the updates are not visible, or they don't work as expected. That is because the custom logic that manages these updates for each plugin, they check for the admin process to not slow down the front end, of course, and that automatically excludes WP-CLI. So now with this new context flag, you can choose the context in which to run for, and that allows you to switch the context into an admin context, for example, when you do a plugin update. And then all of a sudden, all of the premium integrations, they work just as expected. This is a very exciting, this is a very exciting new feature that was built in collaboration with Cloudways, and that we're currently testing in a phase where it is not on by default, so you need to manually use it. but this auto version will become the default in the next iteration.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I could see why you would be excited about that. I think it's really clever that you were thinking like, okay, is it going to be front end or admin? But really by giving the developer the choice gives you the ability to kind of solve for, or at least the developer to solve for multiple use cases at once. I can see why you'd be excited about that, particularly thinking about that hero use case of not being able to run updates for premium plugins. That's a pretty common use case. I can imagine
Yes.
many others that would kind of cascade out of that. I do have some questions though, kind of about, kind of breaking into the roadmap and thinking about backwards compatibility considerations. But we're going to take our first break and we'll be right back.
Time to plug into a commercial break. Stay tuned for more Press This in just a moment.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Press This, the WordPress community podcast on WMR. This is your host, David Vogelpohl. I'm in the middle of interviewing Alain Schlesser about WP-CLI and some backward compatibility conundrums. Alain, right before the break, you were sharing about your favorite feature for WP-CLI recently, which was the global context switching via the flag for whether it be a front end or admin process. And I thought that was really clever. Anything you wanted to add to that before I kind of go into the kind of future roadmap and backwards compatibility?
Yeah, I wanted to add, I'm really looking forward to that because that is probably one of the most frequent support requests that WP-CLI is getting. Why are the updates not working in WP-CLI when they do in the admin backend?
Yeah, that premium plugin repo process thing rears its head in a lot of different places I find in WordPress. But yeah, I could see where that being a core capability where people are like, why the heck doesn't it do this? It's so basic to WordPress. That's amazing. As you think about the future of WP-CLI, and I want to bring in backwards compatibility considerations in a second, but what would be like the top 2 or 3 features you're excited about for the future?
So what I have been planning for quite a while now is to completely overhaul the scaffolding of WP-CLI. The scaffolding command is a command that uses templates to let you generate code, like generate an empty theme, generate an empty plugin. And I want to completely overhaul it to be less of a getting started tool and more of a constant development helper, like it is in the Laravel space with the artisan command, where every concept that is used in WordPress development would have its own command to generate the canonical version of it. And that would not only drastically accelerate development, it would also be a tremendous learning tool and help shape the overall quality in the WordPress space.
Ooh, that one does sound really nice. And I can also start to imagine where backwards compatibility might be playing a friction force there. Any other like roadmap features? That was a pretty good one. Any others you want to add?
There's also work currently being done on a rewrite of the profile command, which is still a third-party command. It is not bundled yet. But as soon as that rewrite is finished, I also want to bundle that command so that everyone has an easy way of profiling their website requests and seeing in what actions and in what filters the main performance bottlenecks are stuck.
Ooh, that's another good one. Okay, so you've got 2 juicy roadmap items. I'm sure more than just that, of course, as you're thinking about the future and other contributors are thinking about the future. But obviously backwards compatibility is a big thing in WordPress. So what considerations are weighing on your mind as you think about your ability to deliver on that roadmap?
Yeah, WP-CLI is, by the way it works, its internals work, is directly tied to the backwards compatibility policy of WordPress core. Right now, WordPress core is still supporting a minimum of PHP 5.6. WP-CLI does so as well. And there is a policy for WP-CLI that whatever the minimum of WordPress is, whenever that changes, WP-CLI will delay that change for at least a year to give everyone the chance to use WP-CLI to migrate from the old sites to the new sites. And because WP-CLI is usually the tool that you use for migrating away from old sites, it needs to still work on these old sites. So WP-CLI can never lead the approach in supporting newer versions of PHP and things like that, because it would then fail its main purpose, which is to get access to the old sites and allow you to port them over. So in that regard, it's really tough to do the development in WP-CLI in a way that keeps the code fresh and maintainable, but still sticks to this very low PHP minimum requirement with WordPress core, which is causing more and more troubles.
When do you, or do you know when core would raise the minimum version number of 5.6 next? Do you have a bead? Is it, because 5.6 is quite a few versions past, and it's difficult to maintain that far back. Do you have a bead on when more recent versions would be the minimum?
I honestly cannot tell. I invested a lot of work into the Server Happy project, where I helped build a lot of mechanisms to make it technically feasible for WordPress core to move quickly towards newer versions of PHP. At this point, all of the technical prerequisites are there. It's just a matter of taking the decision. And I cannot say when that will happen, because it was already planned for quite a while, but so far nothing has happened yet.
And so from the moment it happens, though, you have a year after that when WP-CLI can raise its minimum supported PHP version. Are there other parts of the software stack or languages or whatever that also kind of weigh down as you think about your ability to deliver on the roadmap? Or is it mainly PHP?
It is, yeah, in terms of backwards compatibility, it is mainly PHP. The WP-CLI is built in PHP and in Gherkin and in shell scripts. So Gherkin is a testing language that is not really an issue, and the shell scripts, they haven't changed for 20 years. I don't think there will be a problem anytime soon.
What is the impact? Like, obviously, keeping software compatible with very old versions of PHP is challenging, but like, help me understand, like, how is it challenging? What is a trade-off you have to make because of sticking to support for 5.6?
Supporting 5.6 by itself is not that big of a deal. It's just one version of the language, and it was an uglier language at that time, but still a very usable one. The problem is if you also want to be able to run on the newest version of PHP as well. So you need to cover that entire spectrum. And as long as we're not raising the minimum version, we're just adding more and more versions that we need to support. And with PHP right now, the cadence is that every year there's a new major version that comes out. So they're calling it minor versions, but in terms of features, they are major versions. And the last few releases have seen bigger and more radical changes in the language. And right now, it's really hard to build more low-level constructions in a way that you work both on 5.6 and on 8.2 at the same time, and it will only get worse over time. And what adds to that is that the tooling that you need to work in PHP, you need to run unit tests, you need to run functional tests, and so on and so forth. All of this tooling, it sticks to the PHP cadence. And for something with PHP unit, for example, it is very hard now to write your tests in such a way that the tests themselves work across all of the versions of PHP unit you need to use to cover all of these PHP versions.
Okay, so it's the weight of all these multiple cohorts, if you will, of PHP types, unit tests. And then I'm guessing you're also probably struggling with, you know, how you're using functions in different versions as new functions become available and are deprecated. And it sounds like the collection of all that extra work is friction that weighs down your ability to deliver new features. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, there's also PHP is getting more and more strict. So where before, when you needed to map multiple versions of PHP and you could just keep your code vague so that it didn't hit any of the problems from one version or the other, that is getting harder and harder now, because PHP throws lots of notices and warnings and deprecation issues for the most for the tiniest details by now. And sometimes that means you create a function that you need to then build multiple times and have a mechanism to pull in the right version of that function, depending on which version of PHP you're running in, which exponentially increases the maintenance effort of everything.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. All right. Well, I want to kind of start to explore a little bit about, how you address it, and maybe even your thoughts on how WordPress in general could do better at, addressing backwards compatibility. But we're going to take our last break and we'll be right back.
Time to plug into a commercial break. Stay tuned for more Press This in just a moment.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Press This, the WordPress community podcast on WMR. We're in the middle of talking to Alain Schlesser about the backwards compatibility conundrum with WP-CLI. I should have chosen a less tongue twister title for this show, but here we are. Alain,
it's a good one.
Yeah, I like it. I'll have to say it 3 times fast before it's over. But okay, so before the break, you were talking about kind of this exponential maintenance issue as you start to deal with multiple versions of PHP. And I don't know if this makes you feel any better, Alain, but like 100% of WP Engine's customers are on patched and modern versions of PHP. We force those updates, but obviously not everybody does, right? Not every host does. Not everyone that hosts a website does those things. And so this creates just oceans of sites out there with out-of-date soft PHP versions, or even WordPress, certainly plugins. And so this nature of WordPress, and this idea of backwards compatibility is part of WordPress's strength and its popularity. As a matter of fact, you said it yourself, WP-CLI has to lag because it's doing a job for people that need to upgrade. And so that's a good thing, right? That's a good part of that dynamic. But I'm just wondering on what your thoughts are around how either WP-CLI or WordPress as a whole could improve on keeping those good parts, and maybe avoiding more of the bad parts, like the exponential maintenance requirements of backwards compatibility. What are your thoughts on that writ large?
Yeah, I think right now we're at a point where WordPress is doing its user base a disservice by sticking to that very extreme backwards compatibility approach that it has right now regarding PHP, because all signs seem to be pointing towards the fact that we will slowly enter a phase where we cannot possibly keep WordPress running on the latest versions of PHP anymore, which is a real problem. And we would need a lot of time to work on the compatibility, because the changes are, there's many more changes happening in PHP nowadays. And the only way to solve this is to have a continuous approach of adapting to the PHP cycle. It can lag behind PHP, but it cannot possibly be having a lower velocity than PHP. That will just make the problem worse and worse over time. So it needs to match the velocity of PHP, even if it has a multi-year lag behind it. And then we need to ensure that we can keep everything, the tooling, the testing tooling, and so on, up to date enough so that we can always work on supporting the latest version of PHP. Because as it looks right now, PHP 9 will probably be the first version, as it looks now, that WordPress will not be possible to adapt to if we don't change the approach right now.
So it sounds like this.
Hopefully.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes.
I was going to say, it sounds like this exponential problem that you're dealing with on WP-CLI is kind of compounding, if you will, throughout WordPress, and it's kind of rearing its head, if you will, with like the challenges you mentioned for PHP 9. And so that makes sense in terms of like this force kind of moving WordPress to have to be better about maintaining or matching that velocity so they don't fall too far behind. So WordPress doesn't fall too far behind in PHP versions. In the last couple of minutes here, I know that there's a lot of challenges with backwards compatibility. I know you've been delivering great features and you want to deliver more. And like, I've seen a rush of contributors to Gutenberg, and like, I just feel like this, I would not do service unless we did WP-CLI a little love in this podcast for contributors. How can people contribute to WP-CLI to help keep this really important part of WordPress alive and thriving?
So first of all, we have on the makewordpress.org Slack team, we have a CLI channel. So you can just hop on that channel and say hi and ask questions. And if you want to get started, there's always people that are happy to help you onboard into WP-CLI contributions. And there's also the website makewordpress.org/CLI, which is the entry point for all of the documentation and links to good first issues and so on and so forth. And then ideally, you would join one of the WordCamp contributor days that are happening now again. I'm really glad about that, because during these contributor days, people can actually help you get set up with your own machine to do proper local development with WP-CLI, because sometimes the onboarding is the most difficult hurdle that people have to get started.
Yeah, I can attest to that, knowing a few friends who had gotten into contributing and what they overcame. I know there's quite a few people out there that have little courses and instructions. Of course, Make.WordPress has stuff around that too in terms of documentation, but that's a really good point on contributor days, helping with that aspect of that. I also liked how you called out joining the Slack channel. It kind of reminds me of how Mike Little got involved with WordPress, answering one of commenting on a Mac Mullenweg blog post. But that notion of contributing in a social context leading to something greater. Well, this was super cool, Alain. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So glad to have you here. If you'd like to check out more about what Alain is up to, please visit make.wordpress.org and look up the WP-CLI site, or find him in WordPress.org Slack in the WP-CLI channel. Thanks everyone for listening to PressThis, the WordPress community podcast on WMR. Again, this has been your host, David Vogelpohl. I support the WordPress community through my role at WP Engine, and I love to bring the best of the community to you here every week on PressThis.
The opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of webmasterradio.fm's management or sponsors. Any rebroadcast or redistribution without authorized consent of webmasterradio.fm is prohibited.